Medieval battles are often imagined as moments of clarity-bright armor, banners snapping in the wind, a clean clash that produces winners and losers by nightfall. But the reality was far less orderly. On the ground, medieval war was crowded, loud, and unstable. Plans unraveled quickly. Visibility was poor. Fear spread faster than commands. And most of the men who stood in those lines were not knights chasing glory, but ordinary people trying to survive a situation they had not chosen. Before any weapons were raised, a medieval battle usually began with obligation. Paperwork, oaths, and legal duties mattered as much as swords. In much of medieval Europe, military service was woven into the social system itself. Land came with responsibilities. Towns were bound by charters that required militia service. Villages could be ordered to provide a set number of able-bodied men when a campaign was announced. The details varied by place and century, but the principle remained constant. When the call went out, refusal was rarely a real option. Some men were warriors by profession, at least by medieval standards. A lord's household troops, men-at-arms, and their support staff might serve year-round, sustained by wages, land, or patronage. Others fell into a gray space, semi-professional fighters who trained more often, joined campaigns regularly, and hoped for pay, loot, or advancement. But the largest group in many armies, especially in earlier periods, were levies and local militia. These were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who spent most of their lives far from battle, pulled into service because the system demanded it. That mixture shaped everything that followed. Discipline, equipment, morale, and endurance all depended on who made up the army. One unit might stand under a noble's banner, well-equipped and tightly organized. Another might consist of neighbors with basic gear, little training, and no experience beyond hunting or town watch duties. Medieval armies were uneven by nature. They were also rarely national forces in the modern sense. Instead, they were network kings, relying on major nobles, those nobles calling on minor lords, allied contingents arriving with their own interests, hired specialists joining for pay, and mercenaries signing on because fighting was their livelihood. Even when a campaign carried a grand political or religious label, the reality for most soldiers was simpler and harsher. They were there because a lord demanded it, a council ordered it, a contract paid for it, or because their circumstances left them with no safer alternative. By the time an army gathered, the story of the battle had already begun, not with heroism, but with obligation, imbalance, and men stepping forward because the system gave them little choice. Popular images of medieval warfare place knights at the center of every battlefield. Shining armor, mounted charges, and noble banners dominate the imagination. In reality, knights were usually a minority. The true backbone of most medieval armies was infantrymen on foot, carrying spears, pole weapons, bows, or crossbows, supported by others who handled the unglamorous work that kept an army moving. Even the word knight did not mean the same thing throughout the Middle Ages. In earlier periods, a knight was primarily a mounted warrior whose wealth and status allowed him to maintain a horse, armor, and followers. Later on, as armor improved and tactics changed, many heavily equipped fighters still used horses for travel and prestige, but dismounted to fight when terrain or circumstance demanded it. For this reason, historians often use the term men-at-arms, a broader category that includes both knights and non-knighted warriors who shared similar training, equipment, and battlefield roles. Below them stood the majority, common infantry drawn from every corner of society, peasants from villages, apprentices and craftsmen from towns, foresters and hunters accustomed to using bows, and experienced campaigners who had fought before but never gained noble rank. This social diversity created sharp contrasts in expectation and experience. Two men could stand shoulder to shoulder in the same formation and yet face very different futures. Status mattered most when things went wrong. Noble and wealthy fighters were valuable alive. They could be captured, ransomed, and returned to their families for a price. Ordinary soldiers rarely enjoyed that protection. In the chaos of a retreat or a rout, they were far more likely to be killed, wounded, or simply abandoned to their fate. Wealth also shaped preparation. A knight might arrive with servants, spare equipment, and the means to replace broken gear. A common soldier might have one weapon, one set of clothing layers, and no way to recover if something failed. That imbalance extended to armor. Medieval protection was practical, expensive, and often far less dramatic than modern portrayals suggest. Full plate armor did not dominate the entire Middle Ages. It developed gradually, and even at its peak, it remained out of reach for many. For a large portion of soldiers, the most common defense was layered clothing designed to blunt force and reduce cuts. A padded garment, often called a gambeson or accaton, could absorb impact and turn serious blows into survivable ones. It looked plain, but it worked. Mail armor, made from interlinked rings, was widely respected for its ability to resist slashing attacks and its long lifespan if properly maintained. But it was heavy, time-consuming to produce, and far from invincible. Blunt force still injured the body beneath, and exposed areas, faces, joints, and limbs remained vulnerable. This is why helmets mattered so much. For many soldiers, protecting the head came before fully armoring the rest of the body.
A helmet could mean the difference between walking away and never rising again. Shields, too, played a central role depending on time and place. In earlier periods, they were common across many troop types. Later, as armor improved and two-handed weapons became more widespread, shields appeared less often among certain units. They never disappeared entirely. What matters most is that armor was not a costume. It was a system meant to be worn for hours, repaired on the move, and trusted under pressure. Straps broke, rivets loosened, padding soaked through with sweat and rain, metal rusted if neglected. Day after day, soldiers adjusted and maintained their equipment because survival depended on it. The armor of a medieval army was not polished and pristine. It was scuffed, dented, patched, and worn down by constant use, built not for spectacle, but for endurance in a world where protection was uneven and never guaranteed. The weapon most people associate with medieval war is the sword. It is iconic, symbolic, and heavily romanticized. But on most medieval battlefields, the sword was not the main tool of war. It was a sidearm, valuable, prestigious, and deadly in the right moment. But not always practical in the tight, crowded conditions where battles were actually decided. The true workhorses of medieval combat were spears and pole weapons. Reach mattered. A spear was relatively cheap to make, quick to produce in large numbers, and effective even with limited training. In a packed formation, a man who could strike first from a safer distance had a clear advantage. As tactics evolved, pole weapons diversified. Bills, glaives, halberds, and other variations emerged, each designed to thrust, hook, or deliver force with leverage rather than finesse. Against armored opponents, cutting weapons often struggled. This pushed the growing use of blunt force tools like maces and warhammers, which did not need to slice through steel to be effective. Their purpose was to transmit impact-breaking bones, stunning opponents or crushing joints beneath armor. Axes were also common, in both one-handed and longer forms, partly because they were effective weapons and partly because the skills and materials to make them already existed in everyday life. Missile weapons shaped battles as well, but rarely in the clean, precise way modern audiences imagine. Bows and crossbows were not sniper tools. They were instruments of pressure. Arrows and bolts disrupted formations, forced men to raise shields or close visors, wounded horses, and created a constant sense that danger could come from any direction. Even when casualties were limited, the psychological effect was significant. Crossbows offered power and, in some contexts, simpler training, but they required equipment to span and reload,
slowing the rate of fire. Longbows, where they were used, demanded years of practice and physical conditioning that reshaped the archer's body over time. No matter the type, missile troops faced a hard reality. Ammunition was finite. Carrying endless arrows or bolts was impossible, which meant commanders had to decide carefully when and where ranged fire would matter most. Weather and terrain added another layer of uncertainty. Rain and damp air could slacken bowstrings and damage fletching. Muddy ground slowed movement and exhausted men already carrying heavy gear. A weapon that worked perfectly on a dry training field could fail or become far less effective in real campaign conditions. By the time an army even reached a battlefield, many soldiers were already worn down. Medieval warfare was built on movement. Men marched to mustering points, into contested regions, and then again as commanders maneuvered to find favorable ground or avoid being trapped. Roads were often little more than rutted tracks, and armies moved at the pace of the slowest element in the column, wagons. Animals and men burdened with equipment. Food was a constant concern. Some armies maintained supply trains, but feeding thousands of people for weeks without modern transport or preservation was extremely difficult. Foraging, requisitioning, and buying from local markets were common solutions, and all of them created tension with civilian populations. Areas could be stripped of food quickly, leaving nothing for those who followed. Water posed an even greater risk. Large groups contaminated streams and wells rapidly, and stomach illnesses could spread through a camp in days. The physical toll of constant marching added up as well. Blisters, strange joints, and minor cuts mattered because infection was always close. Footwear was inconsistent and often poorly suited for long marches, especially in wet conditions. A man with ruined feet was not just uncomfortable, he was a liability. Sleep was irregular and rarely restful. Poor rest slowed reactions, weakened morale, and increased mistakes. Small disagreements grew into serious conflicts. Discipline frayed. A medieval army was not a machine. It was a mass of armed individuals trying to stay together under strain. This is why the battle people imagine, a single, decisive day, rarely tells the whole story. The campaign leading up to that day often determined who arrived ready to fight and who reached the field already exhausted, hungry, and on the edge of breaking. The medieval army on campaign was not just a fighting force. It was a moving settlement, a temporary town that crept across the landscape and carried its problems with it. Camps were crowded, loud, and rarely clean. Fires burned day and night. Animals, carts, tools, and men competed for space. Orders traveled slowly, while rumors traveled fast. Sanitation was a constant struggle. Latrines might be dug, but as camps grew or moved quickly, they were often ignored or overwhelmed. Waste, mud, and limited access to clean water created ideal conditions for disease. Historians regularly note that illness reduced armies dramatically, sometimes more than battle itself, especially during long campaigns. A soldier could survive the enemy's weapons and still be taken down by fever or infection before ever reaching the field. Life in camp reflected the army's social hierarchy. High-status men ate better and more consistently. Common soldiers received basic rations, and when supplies ran low, they felt the shortage first. Pay was uneven and often unreliable. Some soldiers served under written contracts, but many relied on customary obligations or vague promises of reward. That uncertainty gnawed at morale. Hunger, fatigue, and doubt rarely inspired discipline. Another constant pressure was maintenance. Weapons needed sharpening. Armor straps had to be checked and replaced. Padding dried when possible, then soaked again in rain. Bowstrings required care, and broken equipment had to be repaired if anyone had the skill and materials to do so. Smiths, craftsmen, grooms, and farriers were essential, even if they rarely appear in heroic accounts. Camp followers, traders, laborers, cooks, and sometimes family members also supported the army, and they faced the same dangers when discipline failed or fighting came too close. Training varied widely. Some units practiced formation work and basic drills. Many did very little. Commanders could give instructions, but turning untrained men into a disciplined force overnight was unrealistic. What they could do was organize, assign positions, define who followed which banner, and set simple rules.
Stay with your group. Hold the line. Do not break formation. Even these basic principles were hard to enforce in a camp already strained by fear and exhaustion. As battle drew near, behavior changed. Men checked their equipment more often. Sleep became lighter and shorter. Every sound carried weight. The tension was not cinematicid, it was oppressive. Pressure built in a place that already felt unstable. Once armies moved onto the battlefield, command faced strict limits. There were no radios, no overhead view, no way to see the whole field at once. Communication depended on shouted orders, messengers, horns, drums, and visual signals like banners. These systems worked when conditions were calm. Battle was anything but. Dust, smoke, terrain, and noise quickly broke communication. Decisions made at the center often reached the edges too late or not at all. To compensate, medieval commanders relied on structure before contact. Armies were arranged in divisions, with on-called battles, with a center and wings. Flanks were anchored against terrain when possible: woods, hedges, ditches, slopes. Missile troops might be placed forward or on the sides to harass the enemy. In some cases, archers protected themselves with stakes or natural obstacles against cavalry. Heavily armored troops were positioned where the line needed staying power, their equipment and training helping them absorb pressure. Cavalry, when present, was used carefully. Horses and riders were valuable. Charging blindly into a wall of spears could destroy that value in moments. Instead, commanders watched for opportunities: uneven ground, a wavering unit, a gap opening under pressure. Flanking, pursuit, and exploitation mattered more than spectacle. At the level of the individual soldier, everything came down to cohesion. A line that stayed together was safer and more effective. A line that broke became a crowd, and a crowd could panic. Medieval commanders understood this, and much of what they did was aimed at preventing their own side from losing shape. This is why banners mattered so deeply. In the confusion, a banner showed where to go, who was still holding, and whether the unit was standing or falling back. When banners fell or drifted away, the battlefield became harder to read, and small failures could spiral into disaster. The first phase of fighting rarely began with a sudden total collision. Skirmishers and missile troops tested positions. Commanders watched for weakness. Missile fire forced men to raise shields, tighten ranks, or advance sooner than planned just to escape the pressure. Terrain immediately shaped movement. Mud, slopes, narrow approaches, and broken ground bent lines out of shape. Advances drifted. Units bunched. Flanks angled to avoid danger. The psychological weight was constant. Battle noise was overwhelming, shouting, metal striking metal, horns, drums, the movement of men and animals. Even disciplined soldiers fought the instinct to step back when danger closed in. Experienced troops were not fearless, but they understood the rhythm of battle and could keep functioning under pressure. Less experienced men reacted faster and harder to sudden movement or missile fire, sometimes creating the very gaps the enemy was looking for. Once the main lines closed, the nature of the fight changed completely. Once the lines met, the battle stopped looking like a single event and became a grinding process. Close combat in a medieval battle was crowded, exhausting, and deeply disorienting. There was little room for wide swings or dramatic flourishes. What mattered were short thrusts, controlled strikes, and the constant effort to keep balance while bodies pressed from all sides. Weapons were used at close range, often awkwardly, as men fought not just the enemy in front of them, but the weight of the formation itself. Shields, when present, were not passive protection. They were tools for pushing, bracing, and holding space.
Pole weapons dominated where there was room to use their reach. But when the press became too tight, fighters relied on shorter weapons or whatever leverage they could find. Sometimes survival came down to staying upright and breathing rather than landing decisive blows. Visibility was limited. A soldier did not see the whole battle unfold. He saw the men directly in front of him, the edge of his shield, the banner he was trying not to lose sight of. Orders were hard to hear. Signals were easy to miss. The real danger often came not from a dramatic charge, but from small failures in the line. A man stepping back to recover, a neighbor drifting sideways. A moment of hesitation. Gaps formed quietly. Once they opened, pressure increased. And once pressure increased, fear spread. Morale was often the decisive factor. Medieval battles frequently ended not when one side was destroyed, but when it lost cohesion and began to pull back. That retreat could turn into a rout with alarming speed. As soon as men started running, those behind them assumed something had gone terribly wrong. Panic fed on itself. Lines dissolved into individuals. Pursuit was often the deadliest phase of the battle, especially if cavalry could move freely. Exhausted soldiers burdened with equipment were cut down or scattered. This was also when captures happened, particularly among high-status fighters. A noble taken alive could be worth a fortune in ransom. That economic reality shaped behavior. Some fighters focused on securing valuable prisoners rather than continuing to fight, while others thought only of escape and survival. The battlefield, after a rout, was not a place of order. Units were mixed together. Banners were lost or separated from the men who followed them. Leaders struggled to determine who was still present and who had fled or fallen. Reforming an army after that kind of collapse was difficult and sometimes impossible. Many commanders chose withdrawal over pressing exhausted, disorganized troops into further fighting. When the noise finally faded, the problems did not. The wounded needed care, but medieval medical treatment was limited by knowledge, supplies, and time. Injuries that might be survivable under clean conditions often became fatal in dirty camps. Infection was a constant threat. So were dehydration and sickness from contaminated water. Survival after battle was uncertain even for those who walked away. Practical work followed. Usable equipment was collected. Prisoners were guarded or negotiated over. The dead were buried when possible, often hastily. Looting was common, driven as much by necessity as greed. Weapons, armor, clothing, and tools were valuable, and many soldiers were not paid in any reliable or modern way. Battlefields were stripped quickly because leaving usable gear behind was a risk few could afford. Status continued to shape outcomes. Captured nobles could become assets. Captured common soldiers faced a range of fates depending on discipline, custom, and circumstance. Some were released, some were forced into service. Others simply disappeared from the record. Beyond the field, the impact spread outward. Villages that lost working-age men struggled to recover. Farms lacked labor. Trades lost skilled hands. Families lost providers. Even survivors often returned home injured or weakened, their ability to work permanently reduced. The cost of a battle could echo for years. The psychological toll was real as well, even if medieval people did not describe it in modern terms. Accounts across history show familiar patterns: disturbed sleep, heightened fear responses, irritability, withdrawal. Medieval war left marks that did not fade quickly. The harsh reality of a medieval battle is that it was never just the moment when two lines met. It was the entire chain. Forced service, uneven equipment, hard marching, sickness in camp, limited command control, fatigue-driven fighting, morale collapse, and then the long aftermath of injury, disease, and economic damage that lingered long after the banners moved on. What survived in memory was often the clash. What shaped lives was everything else.